Thanks for watching Numbskull Music, and today I want to continue to make the case that the 90s was the greatest era of music ever, of course focusing more on rock, hard rock, heavy metal stuff. My first video was about alternative music in the 90s, what a juggernaut it was, and I didn't even get to all the bands. It was like 32, 34, somewhere in there. Just crazy. However, today we're going to focus on bands who started getting traction in the 80s but really just didn't break through. And then the 90s happened, and then they broke through in a major freaking way. There are 10 bands. I'm going to use it as examples, legends, Hall of Famers, you name it. Whatever accolades you want to give them, they all have them. But these 10 bands are a great example of ones who were in the underground scene in the 80s and then busted through in a big way to become part of the foreground and the foundation of the 90s. So let's get started and break this down. All right, we're going to start with the Red Hot Chili Peppers. And this is a perfect example. All right. They started in the early 80s. All right. They kept picking up steam. All right. They were kind of a known quantity in the 80s. I remember watching Flight of the Navigator when I was a kid, and they referenced one of the characters in there referenced going to a Red Hot Chili Peppers concert. That was in 1986. That movie came out. So they've been around for a good minute before the 90s happened, but it wasn't until the 90s that they became a mainstream mainstay on the radio, videos, everywhere. They became monsters in the 90s. 80s, underground, respectable, and successful, but nothing like they were in the 90s. Red Hot Chili Peppers, of course, fit that category. And by the way, I'm not going to use Pantera. They started in the early 80s as well. You know, but they had a different singer, completely different lineup changes. It's fine if you're going to change out drummers. Maybe you change out a guitarist once in a while. But Pantera, to me, it's a little different. The classic lineup didn't start to the late 80s. And it was Cowboys from Hell not long afterwards. So I can't include them. But who I can include, how about Ministry? That's right. These guys started out as a new wave band in the early 80s. Then became one of the forefathers of industrial music towards, I would say, 86, 87-ish. But really broke through with their album of Psalm 69. I believe that was 1990. I have it written down somewhere. 1992. And industrial music, I'm sorry, it was not going to break through, was not going to be part of the 80s. It took the 90s and that 90s crowd to really embrace bands like Ministry. So therefore, again, perfect for this list. Right, here's something that's controversial. How about Queensryche? All right, I know, they're an 80s band. All right, I will admit they're kind of an 80s band, but they didn't become ultra freaking huge until the 90s. Until Empire. Hell, their second biggest album, you can make a case, is Promised Land. Now, I'm not saying classic, remembered, all of that. I'm just talking about album sales. I'm talking about commercial success. There's no doubt Empire's their biggest album. Promised Land is right there close to the second most successful album they had. Operation Mindcrime, I know that's what everyone's going to yell and scream about, but that was like, what, 88, 87, somewhere in there. And both Empire and Promised Land outsold that album. So, yeah. Queensryche had the greatest part of their success in the 90s. Counts. How about R.E.M? I know they had some hits in the 80s. Minor hits. They got a little bit of radio play in the 80s. But they went off like a rocket ship once the 90s came around. Now, you may say, well, they were just finding their footing and all that. R.E.M, I mean, they weren't a new wave band. They really didn't fit into the 80s culture in any kind of way. Definitely not a hair metal band, not a hard rock band. They fit really well into the 90s alternative scene, and that's why they blew the hell up in the 90s. So again, a band that couldn't reach its full potential in the 80s, but when it hit 90s, man, they became a classic. All right, let's talk about Henry Rollins and the Rollins Band. Of course, he got his start in Black Flag. And Black Flag was never going to be a commercially viable band. That's not what it was about. I get that. The Rollins Band really wasn't created more, it was created more in a punk rock ethos. But because of the nature of what the 90s were, just how expansive the palette of the music and rock fans of the time, somehow, some way, the Rollins Band had a huge hit with Liar. Massive video. Probably one of my favorite videos of the 90s is Liar. And that band, really a jazz-infused metal band with a guy in Henry Rollins who's got a good voice, really good lyrically. He's a writer by trade. A vocalist, not too great. I think we can all agree there. But they still had a huge hit with Liar. Only in the 90s could that happen. So there was Henry Rollins he had a name. He built some success in the 80s, but it was the 90s that kicked him into the foreground. And if we're going to talk about Henry Rollins, we have got to talk about Glenn Danzig. Of course, started in the 70s with the Misfits. He started another band in the 80s called Sam Hain. Kind of weird Halloween track sounding music. But it was when he formed the band Danzig, I want to say it was somewhere around 87, 88. And I know that's when the first album came out, and it had Mother on it and did nothing. It was re-released on a live album, but it's basically it's the studio album. It wasn't a live version in 93. And then that blew up into a classic hit of the 90s. Yeah, Danzig, it was never going to be a hit. Was never going to get radio play. Was never going to get on MTV in the 80s. But in the 90s, man, Danzig found an audience in the 90s, finally. Well, here's a controversial pick, Metallica. Of course, they had huge success in the 80s. They finally released the only video they did for one in the 80s, and it was a monster success. They got to play the Grammys, I believe it was in 89. Of course, they lost to Jethro Tull, Metal Album of the Year, which was ridiculous. But that kind of showed where things were in the 80s. No one really respected, not just thrash, but all of heavy metal. And Metallica at the time, and really until today, are the kings of heavy metal. Whether you like it or not, that's what they are. Now they are respected. In the 80s, not so much. They were touring the world. Absolutely, fundamentally. But once you get to the 90s, whether you love the Black Album or not, it's the biggest metal album of all time. And it got there, I'm sorry, but being released in the 90s with those 90s kids did a hell of a lot to propel the Black Album into what it became, which is probably one of the most iconic and largest, most commercially successful metal albums ever. And you know what? Same thing applies for Megadeth. In the 80s, of course, they were successful, huge band, but still an underground band. I don't think they had even a radio hit. They did some videos that no one saw. All right? They were underground, probably one of the biggest underground darling bands ever. But it wasn't until Countdown for Extinction came out, and son of a bitch, all of a sudden Dave Mustaine is a fixture on MTV. He's there all the time. Megadeth is there all the time. He's just everywhere. Megadeth becomes a monster. Again, just like Metallica, because of those 90s crowds embracing what the 80s crowds wouldn't fully embrace. We know Metallica and Megadeth had huge crowds, tons of fans in the 80s, but not like it was in the 90s. They became juggernauts. Now, if we're going to talk about Metallica and Megadeth, we might as well talk about Anthrax in the 90s. There's all this stuff about, oh, the 90s killed thrash. Well, it didn't kill it all, apparently. All right, let's talk about the two most commercially successful albums that Anthrax ever had. Persistence in Time in 1990 and Sound of White Noise in 1993. Now, their move to John Bush was a stroke of genius. Look, all respect to Joey, but John Bush had a 90s voice, a 90s sound. That's why Sound of White Noise today still is their biggest album ever. All right, I understand it's maybe not one of their classics. You know what? It is one of their classics. Like it or not. But of course, at the time, they were going back and forth between John Bush and Joey. Couldn't make up their mind. Their follow-up to Sound of White Noise got delayed all the way to, I believe, 96 or 98, somewhere in there. They filed for bankruptcy. All kinds of crap happened. They couldn't capitalize on the success in time of Sound of White Noise, and it went to hell. But if not for that, Anthrax would have been way bigger in the 90s. But as it stands, the example I'm giving still holds true. Anthrax, because of the 90s, really had the apex of their success. If we're talking about those people, all right, we might as well go ahead for the 10th and final example I'm going to use, Slayer. I know, just like Metallica, Megadeth, and Anthrax, all their classic albums are in the 80s. Absolutely true. However, did you know Divine Intervention hit number 6 when it came out? Their other albums weren't even close. Even those classic albums. Of course, later on, they were beloved then. They're beloved now. But Divine Intervention, like I said, it's their second most commercially successful album. Their most successful album was what was it called? Jesus Illusion, something like that. It's like mid-2000s when that came out. But Slayer in the 90s, they became huge in the skater scene. The X Games and all that stuff. They fully embraced Slayer, and they found a whole new life out of that. And that started in the 90s as well. So even though they were massively successful in the 80s, the 90s, to me, propelled them to even greater heights, just like it did with Metallica, Megadeth, and Anthrax. Now, everybody else, from Flotsam and Jetsam to Death Angel, everyone else in thrash, oh yeah, they all went in the toilet in the 90s. But, not everyone's going to survive. That's the bottom line. And besides, all those bands, your Flotsam and Jetsams, your Exodus and all them, oh hell, Testament especially, they all tried to put out their version of the Black Album or Countdown or Sound of White Noise. They all tried to do that in the 90s. All of them failed. All right, because they had trash vocalists. That's what it was. They didn't have a John Bush. They didn't have a James Hetfield. And even though Dave Mustaine isn't a great vocalist, but the character of his voice just fits the band so well. He's a master at making that happen. Even in Slayer, I mean, the vocal is just a classic vocal. He can yell in key. A lot. If you listen to a lot of this Exodus stuff, great riffs, but they can't even find the key to yell in. It's horrible vocals. And that's why they didn't survive in the 90s. The reason I put this list together is to kind of show what the 90s was. You're essentially taking a bunch of underground bands, even though highly successful underground, but still underground. All right, they weren't anything close to a Guns N' Roses, to Warrant, or Cinderella, or Motley Crue. Nowhere near it. Or Slaughter. All those bands are far more successful. But when you hit the 90s, that's when that underground came to the foreground and really put a stamp, not just on their greatness, but on the greatness of the 90s. All right, that's all I got for this example. But I'll be back with some more crap to show you guys why the 90s was the freaking best era in metal rock ever.